if I'm going to play 9-7 of clubs and I flop a flush draw and a gut shot straight draw, that's really what I'm looking for.
I would a continuation bet.
So I'm a little bit worried about what the limper does.
I think just limping behind is okay too.
I don't really worry about pot control so much when we flop a huge draw.
And the problem is that a lot of these rivers will result in you not getting paid.
Well, greetings everybody and welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Fredlund. We are officially sponsored by Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, and the partners who are contributing to this week's episode include the Poker is Fun Tour and PokerCoaching.com. All right, a couple quick announcements. Just a reminder, if you are out in podcast world, we'd love to have you subscribe to the podcast. We'd also love to have you rate it and leave a comment. And these sorts of things are super helpful as we grow, so I would love to have you take the time to do that for us. That's much appreciated. And also, if you have any other feedback, topic suggestions, hand situations, reach out to me on Facebook, Twitter, or email me at stevefredlund@gmail.com. All right, today we're going to break down a hand situation from a recreational player, Jason Ackerman. And then as we get through that, at the very end, we also had a late submission about tilt control, which is what we talked about on last week's episode. But it was a very good contribution from Derek Smith that came in a little bit late to be able to include in last week's podcast. So I'm going to have that at the end of the podcast after we wrap up talking about Jason's hand. So let's take a quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll come back with that situation. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker. So here's the situation that Jason described. He said, we're a couple hours into the tournament. The average chip stack is about 23,000, and I have 35,000. I believe blinds are at 400, 800. There's one limper, and we are on the button, and we raise to 2,000. So we go to about 2.5x with 9-7 of clubs. The big blind has 14,000 behind. The limper calls and is big stack for about 80,000 chips, and they are a very aggressive player. The flop comes 10 of clubs, 5 of clubs, 6 of diamonds. And reminder, we have the 9-7 of clubs. So at this point, we have a flush draw and we have a gut shot straight draw. So it checks to us. And for pot control, we elect to check back, even though we do have the gut shot and the flush draw. The turn brings the 3 of hearts. So we now have a double belly buster straight draw and a flush draw. So any 8 or any 4 gets us there. The big blind bets 4,000, and the aggressive player raises to 10,000. Now I plan to snap call the 4,000. I figure I have 15 outs to win the pot. I ask the dealer if I call the 10,000, which would leave me with about 23,000, and if the big blind re-raises all in, can the big stack re-raise again? The dealer counts the big blind chips, and he has less than the raise count and says no, but then thinks about it and says yes. Someone says if it's more than half the raiser can re-raise again. I ask again because I'm considering calling the 10,000 but don't really want to call all in on a draw. The aggressive player says yes, I can. So I get the feeling he may have the straight already or 2-pair or at least a strong hand already. He has shown quite a few made hands with small connectors. I don't know what the ruling is and don't have a clear answer from the dealer and elect to muck. I know I don't have the best hand now, but I'm somewhere between 30 to 50% chance of having the best hand after the river. Should I have flat called, raised all in, or folded? And also, what is the ruling of the bet of 4K raise 6K more to 10K, and if the bettor shoves for 4K more in his re-raise, which is 2/3 of the most recent re-raise, can the raiser raise again? I elect to fold and keep my 32,000. Okay, well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff going on there, so we're going to have all of the details of this. What I just read is going to be in the show notes if you got a podcast, or it'll also be on Facebook as well. So you can kind of reread through that and make sure that you have the information you need. So in terms of my thoughts, and then we'll turn it over. First of all, I like the pre-flop raise for sure, except with the limper ahead, I probably go more to about 2,800. Normally, I like to go about 2.5x plus one big for every limper, so I probably make it around 3.5x here. I'm not sure if that would have changed anything. It's a little loose for me to be putting in 15% of my stack pre-flop with a speculative hand, but it does seem to be a pretty good spot. But as we've talked about before, those speculative hands like suited connectors, suited gappers, small pocket pairs tend to decrease in value as the tournaments get deeper because you don't have the same implied odds that you would earlier in a tournament. But either way, with a limper, I don't think it's a bad spot here to put in a raise. I just would probably do a little bit more. Secondly, with about 8,400 in the pot and about 19.5 behind, I would be tempted to ship that flop, just go all in. I wouldn't bet, so either a check or a shove for me. So I don't think your check is bad, but I would probably take a shot at getting to 28,000 if everybody folds. Here, because you raise pre-flop, even though you're on the button, you can still rep an overpair here. And if you get called, you do have a ton of outs. If they are on a bigger flush draw, then you still have the straight outs plus your 9 and 7 are both live. If they have a made hand, then you have the straight and the flush outs. I think you're going to get rid of a lot of Jack 10, Queen 10, King 10 here, as you are definitely repping a better hand. Plus, you'll get rid of a lot of other hands that just called you pre-flop as well. But as it was played, we go to the turn, and I would probably fold like you did here. But as to the question, the big blind bet 4K with 10K behind, which looks super strong, and then the big stack raised to 10K, which is a raise of 6K. If you call 10K and the big blind shoves for a total of 14K, that's a re-raise of 4K when the prior raise was 6K. And this is not a raise in no limit hold'em. This is a call and extra situation per the TDA rules. The only options for the big stack here would be to fold or to call the additional 4K, giving you the same option. So the dealer had the right ruling initially, then they changed it, and frankly, you should have just called the floor over to make sure that you got the exact ruling. But for that to constitute a re-raise, it has to be the full amount when you're playing no limit hold'em. The 50% rule only applies to limit hold'em in all situations, and it also applies when it was a mistake. So for example, if somebody, if it was 4,000 then 10,000, and somebody who had a big stack put in, say, 14,000, that would be a raise because it's more than 50% of that 6,000 raise amount, and so they would be required to put in a raise to 16,000. But that's just in a mistake situation. If it's an all-in situation, it has to be a full-size raise to reopen the action. So the ruling was wrong, and so I'm not sure how that would have changed things for you, but they could not have reopened the pot. So as it was played, I would fold, but I would have either folded pre-flop, even though it's a good steal situation. It's such a big chunk of my stack, and I don't like suited connectors as much late in tournaments. But you could have also limped it. That's another option as well. Ultimately, if I played it, I would have taken a more aggressive approach. If I'm going to play 9-7 of clubs and I flop a flush draw and a gut shot straight draw, that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that I can continue my aggression with. They both check to me, so I think it's a good opportunity to just get it in there pretty aggressively and hope I don't get called. And if I do, I've got a ton of outs for probably the best hand. So it's a tough spot, tough decision there, but that's the direction that I would have taken. As played, I probably just fold like you did as well. If I'm going to check to the turn, I only have one card to come. I might be drawing a lot thinner than I thought. So I probably just fold on the turn there like you did as well. So with that, let me turn this over. We received some audio submissions from Chris Gorton, Taylor Moss, and Matt Hamilton.
So I would likely have folded the 9-7 suited, or maybe limped as well if I figured the blinds are not aggressive. If I had raised pre-flop, I would have continuation bet, and if re-raised, folded. But if just called, then probably just check the turn, if checked to me at that point. If bet and raise in front of me at that point, I'd likely fold. If just a normal raise, then call and see the last card. If hit a straight or flush, bet or re-raise. If pair, just call unless an all-in, or bet and re-raise in front of me, then I'd fold as well. I am interested to hear what others suggest. Thanks for listening, and Steve, thanks for putting this all together.
Greetings, Rec Poker fans. This is Taylor Moss. This week we're talking about a hand where we raise from the button, get a call, and then are deciding what to do on the flop. So the tournament situation is we have about 35,000 in chips. The blinds are 400, 800, so if we equate that to a stack, we have just over a 40 big blind stack. The action, we have a limper to us, and we're on the button. So first, I think I can write a book about punishing limpers. Problem is, I don't have time to write it, no one would read it, and no one would buy it. So I won't write the book, but I'll give you quick insights of how to punish limpers. And the first mistake here is raising to 2,000. This is way too small of a raise. We're making it 2.5 big blinds after a limper is in there. So in terms of the size of the pot, it's not that big. It entices the big blind to call us, and it also entices the limper to call us. So what we're essentially doing here is inflating the size of the pot without getting anyone out of the hand. And that's the opposite of what we want to do. We either want to limp behind, which I never say to limp, but this is a situation where we can limp, knowing that we're not going to get the opponent out of the hand, and by raising small like this, it's not accomplishing much. What I would prefer doing is, if we want to play this 9-7 of clubs, raise much bigger. So the normal raise size would be to 2,000, but we should probably add a big blind for every limper that we see, which makes it a minimum of 2,800. And given our opponent and the stack size he has, I'm not opposed to raising even higher, given that we have a speculative hand of 9-7 of clubs. We want to get this player out of the hand because what we're trying to do is win it right here and now. So, of all the options, I think raising small is the worst. Raising bigger is better. Calling is all right. And folding is even all right. We only have 9-7 of clubs. It's not that great of a hand. We can fold and wait for a different opportunity. But I think raising to 2,000 is a very passive play. After we raise to 2,000, the big blind calls and the limper calls. He's a big stack and a very aggressive player. So with that, that kind of concerns me about his limp. He open limped, he has a big stack, and he's a very aggressive player. So what is he really limping with? The most likely options are either he has a monster, which if he hasn't been limping before and all of a sudden he limps, that might be a sign that we might be in trouble. Or he has a small pocket pair, which a lot of players tend to do is limp with small pocket pairs, trying to see a cheap flop and see if they can flop a set. So I'm a little bit worried about what the limper does. Well, the flop comes 10 of clubs, 5 of clubs, 6 of diamonds. So we get a gut shot straight draw, and we have a flush draw, and it checks to us. So we elect to check. I don't like it. I really don't. We have all these outs, and if we win the hand here, are we really that upset that we just took down a 6K pot? I don't think so. So I want to lead out, and I'm going to bet a decent amount. With the 6K pot, I'm probably betting 3.5K, something in that range, and trying to get someone to fold. And if they raise me, we do have the option to re-raise, knowing that we have a lot of outs. Even against a flopped set, say they have 6s here, we have, I believe, about a 33% chance to win. So we do have a decent equity if we do get called after we go all in. Now, that's not the action I would like to see, but it could happen. We need to be prepared for that. But we don't know exactly how this would play out, but the turn does give us some information of how a flop bet would have played out. So instead we check. The turn brings the 3 of hearts, so we have a double gut shot as well as the flush draw. Now the big blind bets out for 4,000, which seems odd. Usually they only make this play if they have a hand. And then the aggressive player raises to 10,000. So now we're in a tricky spot. What would that aggressive player be re-raising to? And what would they have? Do they have an overpair? Do they have a flop set? At this point, I know I was talking about shoving on the flop with the straight and flush draws, but there's one card to come, and we could be drawing very thin. They may have a higher flush draw than us, and we really need to hit a straight. They might have a straight already made, that big blind, you never know what they have. Or they could have a set, and a lot of our flush outs are counterfeited with his full house outs. So, all in all, I think after this, you fold. I know there's a lot of confusion about can they raise after you call and stuff like that, but I think I just give it up. There's 2 people showing aggression now. We had our chance on the flop to be the aggressor, and we lost it. We gave up that option to someone else. They took over for us, and now I think we need to give up the hand. So with this hand, I believe we made a lot of mistakes, and a lot of it came down to how aggressive we could be. We needed to be more aggressive pre-flop. If we're going to raise, we have to raise bigger. We have to make it tough for the limper and the big blind to call and see a flop. Likewise on the flop, we get a flop that hits our hand. We have a lot of outs after this, but we check back. We give up the aggression in the hand to someone else, and then the turn, they take it away from us and show that aggression. So we don't know what our opponents had, but I think we have to give them some sort of credit with the bet and raise on the turn.
Hey, this is Matt Hamilton, and this is my recording for Jason's hand for the Rec Poker podcast. So just to quickly go over the details here. Jason is 35,000, blinds are 4 and 800, 1 limper on the button. So we decided to raise to 2,000 with 9-7 of clubs, and the big blind calls, and the limper calls. So I'm going to make a quick note here and say I think the raise is somewhat questionable. So you said the limper has 80,000 and is a very aggressive player. With those 2 things in mind, I think calling the limp on the button, so just limping behind, makes a lot of sense. The problem with raising a very aggressive player is he can limp raise. So, I don't know, obviously at this point we don't have a lot of information. Maybe he's never limped raised. Maybe every time he limps, he's never gonna come back and 3-bet. So, maybe the raise is okay. But also I would say that a hand like 9-7 of clubs is a little dicey in general. I think it's okay to fold this hand pre-flop, but when you're facing a limp, I think just limping behind is okay too. Obviously, if it was folded to you, a raise is great with this hand from the button. But when a big stack limps in front of you, I think limping behind on the button with this hand is perfectly reasonable. I do see merit for raising, but not against an aggressive player with a huge stack, to be honest. So anyway, and keep in mind, you raise here to 2,000 and the blinds are 4 and 800. I think that's a pretty small raise size to decide to make here. You raised under 2.5x, and that's with a limp in front of you. So generally, I like to bump it up to 3.5, maybe 4x when there's a limp or multiple limpers. I think at least 3x. So I think going to at least 2,400 facing a limp if you want to raise. Because otherwise, 2,000, what does that really accomplish? I don't think it accomplishes much there. So anyway, You raise to 2,000. Big blind calls, has 14,000 behind. Limper calls, and you see that flop. I love the check back on the flop. I really love it. I think a lot of people will continuation bet this flop. 9-7 of clubs on a 10-5-6 2-club board. I think a lot of players will continuation bet this, but I think honestly I prefer the check back because you really hate to lead out here, continuation bet this flop and get check raised by a hand like 5-6 or 5-5 or 6-6 that's looking to check raise that flop. I love the check back on the flop. Give us a free turn card. I think that's great. So we check back, and the turn is the 3 of hearts, and it brings you the double belly buster. Okay, so this is where the interesting part comes in. Big blind bets 4,000, aggressive player raises to 10,000. So I think it's really wise of you to ask about this scenario, being that the big blind is only going to have 4,000 behind when he Okay, so big blind leads for 4K, has 14,000 in total behind. Aggressive player raises to 10K, which is a raise of 6,000, and then the big blind's going to have 4,000 on top of that for his all in. So I like that Jason here asked for clarification. However, what I would say is when the dealer kind of flip-flopped like this, so he mentions the dealer initially counts the chips and says, no, it doesn't reopen the betting, but then after a different player at the table says, well, what about if it's over half the raise size, does it reopen? Then the dealer goes back and says, oh, yes, it does reopen. At this point, call the floor. Just call the floor right away, because clearly the dealer is not sure either way. And you don't want to get involved in a huge pot and a huge spot, and you're not sure of what the correct ruling is. So bring the floor over. There's no harm in that, and get a correct ruling, hopefully a correct ruling. Get the final decision anyway. Once the floor makes the decision, that's the decision, regardless of what the correct ruling is. So bring the floor over. No shame in that. Get the correct ruling. Make your decision from there, because I think it's important to know. Because once I think you calling behind makes a lot of sense. Given your implied odds, you got a flush draw, you got a double belly buster. You can be pretty certain your flush draw is good. Otherwise, the aggressive player is probably not going to be raising with a bigger flush draw. That wouldn't make much sense. So you can assume your flush draw is good. You can assume your straight draws are good. I like calling the 10,000 with the assumption that if the big blind's going with it, you're going to call 4,000 more on top and get the correct ruling. So, as far as the correct ruling goes, Steve, in your email you mentioned that as far as you're aware, the ruling was incorrect. And that is true. But honestly, it's not even really a ruling. The dealer just kind of said something and then said, oh, wait, nope. So really, just bring the floor over, get an official ruling, and you can rest a little bit easier. So that being said, what the dealer was getting mixed up with and what the player at the table was getting mixed up with was this idea of a raise 50% or more. So the only rule here is that if a player throws out a raise, let's say someone bets 1,000 and a player throws out 1,600 or 1,500. If it's 50% or more of a bet, it has to be a raise. So he would have to throw out 2,000. So maybe that's what the dealer was getting confused with. In this situation, it does not reopen the betting. The all-in would have to be a full raise in order for it to reopen the betting to the raiser, which would be the aggressive opponent. It would have to be a full bet. So yeah, in conclusion, I think the biggest takeaway from this hand is if you're ever unsure of a situation, you're not sure what the correct ruling is, don't just ask the dealer, because while there are great dealers out there, and dealers generally know a lot more about the rules than the players, in a lot of cases, not all dealers will know every rule. Like, that's a lot to keep in mind. So just call the floor, especially in a situation like this where it's important and the dealer just flip-flopped, just changed his mind so quickly like that. So yeah, bring the floor. That's a good lesson to learn here. And once the floor comes, hopefully makes the right decision, says the betting's not reopened, you can call the 10,000 correctly, in my opinion, and see a river. So that's my thoughts for this hand.
Okay, with that, let's take a quick break and then we'll hear from our experts. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker.
He's won $1 million!
Hi, this is Mike Schneider, founder of the Poker is Fun Tour, which you can find at piftpoker.com, and also a member of the Minnesota Poker Hall of Fame and full-time limit poker player, and also part-time no-limit tournament poker player. So hi, Jason here. I just want to quickly address the ruling of this hand, and starting off, you really shouldn't just make a decision to fold just because of the ambiguity of the ruling. Like in this scenario, I feel like you'd be perfectly within your rights to ask for a floor to come over and clarify what exactly will be allowed to happen if you call. Just because like that information's pretty important here. Like if we're going with our read of that we think that the limper has a pretty strong hand, we're pretty happy to call it 10,000, but we don't want to end up having to put our full 35,000 in. So, I mean, yeah, like if the ruling should have been that there would be no option for the under the gun limper to re-raise if the big blind goes all in. So, yeah, like if the dealer seems uncertain or if you don't think it's going to be the right ruling, for sure, just completely 100% ask for a floor to come over to clarify what can happen here if you were to cold call. So as for the hand plate itself, I personally am not a fan of checking behind on this flop with 3 opponents in and just there already being a good, looks like 8,000 or 9,000 in the middle of the pot, depending on what the antes were and whatnot. I think given our stack size sitting with 33,000 left, I would like to fire a bet on the flop. It doesn't even have to be large. It could be 2,500, 3,000, somewhere in that range. Just the reason is if we take it down right there, that's fantastic. That adds a lot of chips to our chip stack. And moreover, we flopped a huge draw. I don't really worry about pot control so much when we flop a huge draw. Like, I mean, unless an opponent literally has a hand like 8-6 of clubs would probably be the worst scenario for us, or even then we still have a live flush draw. So we'll say maybe like ace-6 of clubs where they block our flush draw, they have a pair already. Like, we're still in pretty good shape against them. So when I play these kind of hands, even though yes, it is only a few hours into the tournament, I look at them at the same way as if I get aces dealt to me pre-flop. I'm happy to get aces dealt in, or get aces all in pre-flop. So this same spot here where we have almost always flopped 12 outs, sometimes 15 outs, sometimes 18 outs, depending on if they have a pair of 5s or 6s or anything like that. I'm just simply with 2 cards to come, I'm happy to bet, and if somebody raises, I'll just shove all in probably right there. You might get them to fold a 10. You might get them to fold if they had check raise with pocket 9s or something like that. And if they raise you and then fold your all in, you just won even more chips. And even if they call, you should be almost always at least 50-50 against them. There's only going to be, if they flopped a set or if they have one of those ace-6 club type hands, those are about the only ways that you aren't going to be close to a coin flip against them. So yeah, I would definitely strongly advise that you should be betting on this flop. Like if you had, say, 9-7 of diamonds where you flopped a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw, that's the kind of flop where here with 3 other guys in the pot. Now we might want to check it back because we'd love to see a turn card with 3 players in. There's a solid chance somebody's going to call our bet. And I say solid, not 100%. We definitely can get 3 folds on this flop if we bet, but 9-7 of diamonds is more the kind of hand where you would think about knuckling back on this flop. Just since you'd like to see a turn card where you might turn a diamond, you might hit an 8, and then nobody's going to really put you on a straight, so you may end up getting somebody to stack off with top pair thinking that you're trying to push them around. So then back to how we did play it now on this turn here. With this ruling in play, assuming that it is in fact true that our under the gun limper can re-raise a raise, and assuming that your read is correct that the under the gun player does in fact have a huge hand, I think your fold is fine. I think though the thing is we have to be pretty confident that your read about him having a huge hand is correct. If we aren't that confident about it, I would probably, again, just shove all in because there's a lot of chips in the pot. In under the gun player, it's going to be pretty tough for him to call just a 10, although the way how you described him, I think there is a pretty good chance he will call with just a 10. But I, again, still think with all those outs, all these players don't have to fold a hand that often to make an all-in shove, positive expectation move. I looked at this hand as if I was playing it in the moment, so I didn't run any kind of calculations on it, but I have ran calculations, and especially pre-flop too, but pre-flop and post-flop scenarios about what fold equity does to change how good or bad an all-in shove is, and my gut instinct says here the opponents don't have to fold their hands too often to make a all-in shove correct here. So even the percent of the times that you get a call here, you're making up your equity back. All those other times you get a fold, and then when you get called and you still have a ton of outs to make your hand, it just seems like the correct play to me on the turn, as long as we aren't 100% confident under the gun is only doing this with a monster. If it has played, and if our read is he can only have a monster, I think folding is perfectly reasonable. But had we got a ruling that said he can't re-raise, I would say 100% cold call that 10,000 given our read if he has a lot of strength, because we would love to catch a river card where we can then get our last 25,000 in the middle and he's going to call because he has a huge hand, and now we just vaulted up into a monster chip stack range, and it's a good place to be in this stage of the tournament. So yeah, that's about all I've got. And just one other little aside, I'm going to be this winter, I'm hoping to maybe take on a couple of students that, in terms of a poker coaching role. If that is something that might interest you, it could be for limit games like Hold'em, Stud 8, Omaha 8 or better, a little bit of Raz, or Big O, or also no limit tournament play. And that's something that might interest you. I'm looking pretty open-ended here, like looking on a case-by-case basis of evaluating what students might want from me, how often, like whether we're doing email, Skype, meeting in person, etc. I'm just going to try to cater it to what each individual person is hoping to get out of it and what their expectations are of me and where their focuses are, to be able to come up with what a hourly price or what kind of package plan they might do. But anyway, if you have any interest in that, you feel free to reach out to me at Schneids Poker on Twitter. That's SCHNEIDS Poker. So yeah, until next time, this is Mike Schneider. of the Poker is Fun Tour.
Dude, people are like, are you little? Because your name says you're little. I say, no, I'm not little.
So here we're going to review a hand by Jason. So here we have 35,000 chips. You mentioned the average chip stack is 23,000, but I think that's generally somewhat irrelevant because most people don't have the average chip stack. Anyway, 30 big blind average stacks, you have 40. You believe the blinds are 400, 800. Well, it's important to know what the blinds are. Anyway, one person limps. We would like to know the limper's position. You raise to 2,000 with 9-7 of clubs. So I think, first off, your raise size is way too small here. When you make it 2,000, very often the players in the blinds, or at least the big blind, will call because it's only 1,200 more. And also the initial limper is going to call every time. So what you're doing is you are making the pot bigger with a hand that is very likely behind. So why do you want to play a bigger pot behind? Now, obviously, you're in position. You're going to realize more of your equity. But even then, it's not like you're going to crush your opponents in this scenario. So I definitely would have raised bigger if I'm going to raise, probably to about 3,000 or so. Typically, you want to go about a pot size raise or a little bit less. A pot size raise here would be to about 3,600, 4.5 big blinds. So you see your 2,000 is just very, very, very tiny. Whenever you're picking your bet sizes in general, you always want to ask, what am I trying to accomplish here? And you certainly don't want to get called by everyone when we're playing somewhat shallow stacked poker with a hand that is likely behind. Anyway, big blind calls with 14,000 behind, which is certainly very relevant. The limper, a big stack, and a very aggressive player, I guess, calls as well. I would definitely not raise a very aggressive player, because if you raise his limp, he's very likely to re-raise. That said, his position matters, and also how often he's limping matters. Because if he's limping a bunch of hands, I don't really know if you want to call him a very aggressive player, right? Aggressive players are applying aggression, and limping is not applying aggression. So maybe if this player's never limped, then alarm bells would be going off in my head, and I would just call. If I think this guy's going to limp re-raise, I would also just call. So it's okay to call on the button with hands that flop well, because then you're playing a small pot in position, which is much better than playing a big pot in position with an equity disadvantage. Anyway, flop comes 10, 6, 5, giving you a flush draw and a gut shot. Checks to you. You like to check for pot control. And I don't really think this is what pot control means. Pot control means checking behind with a likely good made hand so that we don't face significant aggression. Here, we don't have a good made hand. We have a draw. And with your draws, you want your opponents to fold out whatever equity they have a lot of the time. Like imagine someone sitting in this pot with king jack and the other player has ace 9. If you bet and they fold, that's fantastic. If someone does decide to make you play for all of your money, you're going to have to do that because you have a very good draw, right? You probably have 40-something% equity, and that's okay. That's the spot you got yourself in by raising over the limper. Clearly, if you bet, let's say 3,500 on the flop and the 14,000 stack, big blind shoves, you have a really easy call. And if the very aggressive player raises, let's say, I don't know, 6,000 or 8,000, whatever, you can then shove with a little bit of fold equity. So I think betting leads to a lot of good scenarios. And also betting will allow you to play a bigger pot when you happen to get there, and also allow you to bluff, especially when the turn something like an ace or a king or a queen or a jack, right? Because all those cards should look scary to a lot of the marginal made hands on the flop. So in general, with your draws, you're almost always going to want to bet, especially if your draws don't have showdown value. All right, turns to 3 of hearts, which is, it's okay. It gives you an additional 4 for a straight. So big blind bets 4,000, aggressive player raises to 10,000. So you plan to call the 4K, which I think is fine, although I maybe would have gone all in over the 4K. You say you figure you have 15 outs to win the pot. Well, that's 9 for your flush, and then 6 for your straight, which is 15. Problem is that maybe your flush draw is not good, right? You always want to keep that in mind. And if your flush draw is not good, it also it just really, really decreases your equity. So you ask the dealer, if you call the 10K, which would leave you 23,000 behind, if the big blind could re-raise, can the big stack re-raise? Well, it depends on the rules for your casino. And it's very important to understand the rules of where you're playing. It's very important to understand the game you're playing, and you also need to understand the rules of the game. I wrote a blog post about this a while back at jonathanlittlepoker.com discussing a few lesser unknown rules, or lesser known rules, and this is one of them, and it varies casino by casino. And if you're playing somewhere, you need to know the rules of the game, and if you're not, you're making some huge error. Because right here, it could very easily cost you. Imagine you call and then the guy can raise and then reopen the action. Well, then that's kind of a disaster, right? Or if he shoves, it reopens the action. That's not good for you because you really don't want to play for all of your money. But in this scenario, I don't think it really matters that much. And I think you have a pretty easy fold because you effectively are playing for all of your money. If you had to put in 10,000 to call and see the turn, knowing you're never getting raised, even then you're not loving it because you don't really have a good opportunity to win this pot on the river because very often the aggressive player is just going to bet again and make you fold out your hand. So you ask the dealer what the rule is, and that's another mistake. Do not assume the dealer knows the rules, which is a little bit unnerving, but you should get the floor man over there and ask, because the floor man, in theory, is the person who knows the rules. And if you ask a floor man what the rule is, and everyone generally agrees with it whenever the floor man says something, if he's wrong and they call over another floor man, usually they won't turn over that ruling because that floor man told you that, and you're supposed to be able to assume the floor men know what they're talking about. Very rarely do rulings get overturned if the table agrees with him. Now, the table may throw up a stink whenever he says, yeah, he can re-raise, or yeah, he can call, but then they'll call over the real floor man, and then you'll get a final decision, and that'll be that. I know it's a little bit of a pain, but that's the price you have to pay for not knowing the rules of the game. All right. You say you don't have a clear answer from the dealer. Well, again, don't ask the dealer, and also it's very, very important to get an answer from someone whose answer matters. It's like asking the people at the table, oh, can I re-raise here? And, I mean, they're not going to tell you, right? And then they don't even know. Realize most people don't know what they're talking about. It's very, very important. All right. You know you don't have the best hand, but you're somewhere between 30% and 50% of having the best hand after the river. I don't know how you think you're 50% to have the best hand after the river, because you don't have anywhere near 50% equity. You definitely want to realize how much equity you have. Even using, basic rule of 2 and 4, which will leave you with a wrong answer, but a close enough answer. Here you're going to have about 30% equity going to the river. And the problem is that a lot of these rivers will result in you not getting paid. Like if the straight draws come in, it's kind of scary given all those straight cards on the board. And if the flush card comes in, if your opponent's sitting there with like ace 10, he's probably not going to pay you either. So it's a pretty rough spot. And you ask if what you really should have done here. And I would have just folded, because it's too likely you're against a strong made hand or you're against a better draw. If you thought the player who made it 10K would ever fold to your $22,000 or $21,000 all in, remember it's just 11,000 more, then sure, you should shove every time, because if he's ever folding, that's just a huge success. But he's probably not going to fold very often, and he's going to call with his ace 10 or whatever he has, and then you're just going to be behind. So do you want to put all your money in behind? The answer is no. Do you want to put half your money in decently far behind and not have great implied odds? Although, you're getting paid a lot of the time, but not always. And I think the answer, again, to that is no. So you have a pretty easy fold. On the turn, if instead the big blind bet 4,000 and the aggressive player called 4,000, I would have gone all in, most likely. If you think the big blind's going to fold, notice he would have 8,000 behind, I think, which is some amount of fold equity, not a ton, but the thing is there, if you shove and get called by the big blind and the aggressive player folds, then you're getting roughly break-even pot odds anyway. And you do have fold equity in that spot. So that's what I would have done if it was a bet and a call. I would not have called behind a lot of the time unless I thought for sure I'm getting called every time and I don't have fold equity. That's kind of what you need to be thinking about. You don't want to necessarily be thinking, oh, I have a draw, so I'm going to call. You want to think, if I raise, will I make my opponents fold out a lot of better hands? And clearly, whatever they fold in this spot is going to be better than yours. So very often with draws that don't have a lot of implied odds and are barely getting the right price, you're going to want to look for a different way to play those hands. So that's it. This is Jonathan Little. Check out my site at pokercoaching.com.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody who contributed to this episode. Thank you, Jason Ackerman, for contributing that hand situation. It's always tricky, isn't it? I'm going to close off here, but then reminder that after this, we are going to play the audio from Derek Smith, who had a late submission talking about tilt control. So when I'm done speaking, we'll just hear from Derek, and then that'll be over. But just a couple of things here. Reminder, please subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't yet, rate the podcast and leave a comment. All truthful, please. But all of those things are super helpful as we grow. It helps it get promoted a little bit more fully. The the more engagement we have from our listeners. So we'd love to have that. We know that our listenership continues to grow, but we'd love to see it kind of flow through those ratings and comments. You can do that right on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, any other feedback, topic suggestions, hand situations, send to me on email, stevefredlund@gmail.com, or throw it on Twitter or Facebook. And so with that, let's hear a follow-up from last week's episode on tilt control from Derek Smith, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you all.
Hey, this is Derek Smith, the Rec Poker Podcast, and regarding tilt control, I think I might have a little bit of a unique sort of spin on this, and I'm by no means an expert, and for the first half dozen years of playing poker, I was a complete spaz at the table and just terrible all in all, dealing with bad beats and the like. And though my feedback is probably not groundbreaking, I do think I have a somewhat interesting sort of comparison to help back up what I think is the best way to deal with tilt with bad beats and just staying in control and not letting tilt affect your game. Again, this isn't going to be groundbreaking, but I've found that dealing with bad beats and keeping in control and not letting tilt take over is just something that gradually happens by playing more and more. The more you see things, the more that what you see isn't new, the more situations you've dealt with, the more equipped you are to deal with them. And I realize for newer players, that's not the best advice because they want a simple ABC sort of answer to how to deal with it. So you can do breathing exercises and you can start doing yoga and meditation. You can try all these different things, but honestly, in my opinion, you just have to keep playing, and over time, those things that used to set you off are just, whatever. It's happened a lot before. And so for the casual rec everyday player, I think when you put in enough time and volume, you'll find that over time, that the things that really ticked you off previously just really won't anymore. And so the sort of what I thought the comparison or the unique spin is, I am a musician as well as a poker player and a dad and a creative director at work and things like that. But a part of playing music is performing and being live in front of people. And for the first 5 years of playing locally live, hundreds of shows, I experienced a ton of stage fright. I play guitar and sing, and I at some points would be so incredibly nervous that I could hardly get on stage, let alone control myself from shaking and things like that. And generally, particularly in my early 20s, the way to deal with that would be a heavy amount of alcohol before the shows, and things would work out okay and we'd have fun and everything would be okay. However, that still was just sort of masking what was stage fright. And what I found, which is similar to poker, was one day, maybe 5, 6, 7 years into playing shows, one day I went to play a show and I was getting ready up on stage, getting everything ready for the sound check, and I just didn't feel nervous that day. And I don't know how to explain that, but from that day forward, I've never really felt nervous about playing live. And I don't think that I've, so greatly improved in my musicianship to not warrant being nervous. I don't think I'm anything amazing or special. I just think I've played enough shows to have that feeling of complete terror sort of go away. And so in a somewhat similar comparison, I think that's kind of what happens with poker is you play enough times, and it doesn't really have to do with being nervous about playing, but the comparison being more you've played enough times, you've experienced enough things that eventually you've seen it all, and so nothing is new and nothing really shocks you anymore. And that's kind of the way it went for me with poker too. I went from being just terrible at dealing with bad beats, awful with tilt control, and at some point in time, I've played in a league for about 12 years. One of the seasons, I took a terrible beat early in a season, and I just kind of got up and left the table and was completely shocked with myself as I drove away that I wasn't berating myself or in my mind mad at the other player for the quote unquote bad play they made. It just was what it was. And moving forward now, it just is what it is. I certainly don't like to take a bad beat. I certainly like to get it in with the best and like it to hold, but when it doesn't, it doesn't. And shrug my shoulders and move on. And I think that you can learn a lot from situations even where you lose. So that's kind of my take. It's somewhat unique, maybe just in the sense of comparing sort of playing music to it, but to, tilt control. But that really is not the greatest advice for a rec player, considering that they probably are looking for an answer that's like quick fix. But I don't think that, having strong tilt control and being able to handle bad beats is the type of thing that you can just say, do this, do that, do the breathing, do meditation, do yoga. I'm not sure any of those things. I think you just have to keep playing and play through it. And eventually you just hit this level of volume where nothing that happens kind of surprises, shocks you, and sets you up to experience tilt. So hopefully you find that interesting, unique, maybe not extremely helpful, particularly for the players that have already played for a long time, but for those that haven't been playing for a really long time, over the years, over enough games, over enough hands, with enough volume, I think you really will just see that your tilt control will improve and your level of frustration with getting bested by the worst of it sometimes, that'll slowly subside. So thanks a lot.